and let the comments know where in the world this video is finding its way to tonight. It's always fascinating to see how many corners of the globe share this interest in understanding institutions that have been so thoroughly distorted by centuries of Orientalist representation and sensationalised storytelling. Now, find that comfortable spot, maybe dim the lights, perhaps turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into a story about the actual daily lives of Ottoman harem women, not the fantasy versions that Western artists and writers created, but the real experiences of real women who lived within these elaborate household structures. Women who ranged from powerful queen mothers who effectively ruled empires to enslaved servants, who performed menial labour, from highly educated and influential royal consorts to young girls being trained in music and arts. The diversity and complexity of their experiences being impossible to capture in the simplified and sensationalised narratives that have dominated popular understanding of the harem for centuries. The challenge being to look past the myths and the fantasies to see the actual institution, with all its hierarchies and its routines and its human dimensions, understanding it within its own cultural context, rather than judging it entirely by standards and assumptions imported from very different societies and very different historical periods. When modern Western audiences hear the word harem, the mental images that arise are typically drawn from 19th century Orientalist paintings and from various fictional representations in literature and film, visions of languid women lounging on cushions in gossamer garments, of mysterious and exotic spaces dedicated entirely to sensual pleasure, of countless women all competing for the attention of a single powerful man, the imagery being remarkably consistent across various representations and being remarkably divorced from historical reality. These popular images telling us more about Western fantasies and anxieties about sexuality and power and gender than they tell us about actual Ottoman institutions and actual experiences of Ottoman women. The Orientalist tradition in European art and literature, which flourished particularly during the 18th and 19th centuries when European powers were increasingly involved in the Ottoman Empire politically and economically and militarily, created elaborate fantasies about Ottoman harems based on very limited actual knowledge and based more substantially on European preconceptions and desires. European male artists and writers who generally had no access to actual harems and no understanding of Ottoman culture, creating detailed representations that said more about European sexual imagination than about Ottoman reality. The paintings showing women in various states of undress in elaborate architectural settings, the literature describing scenes of passion and intrigue and exotic pleasure, all of it being essentially European fantasy projected onto Ottoman institutions that Europeans did not understand and often did not want to understand accurately, preferring their fantasies to any reality that might be more complicated or less titillating, the Orientalist gaze being fundamentally about European power and European desires rather than being about genuine understanding of other cultures, using the Orient as screen onto which European fantasies and anxieties could be projected, creating imaginary worlds that served European purposes rather than representing actual places and actual people with any accuracy or respect. The reality of the Ottoman Imperial harem, known as the Harem-i Hümayun, was dramatically different from these Orientalist fantasies, being an elaborate household institution that served multiple functions within the Ottoman political and social system, housing not just the Sultan's wives and concubines, but also his mother and sisters and daughters, along with large staffs of servants and slaves and attendants and administrators, the entire establishment being governed by strict hierarchies and elaborate protocols that structured daily life, and that distributed power and authority according to complex systems that evolved over the centuries of Ottoman history. The harem was physically located within Topkapi Palace in Istanbul, occupying a substantial portion of the palace complex in buildings that were architecturally sophisticated and elaborately decorated, but that were primarily functional spaces designed for living rather than for the sensual luxury that Orientalist fantasy imagined. Rooms being organised according to hierarchy, with the most important women occupying the best spaces while servants and lower-ranking concubines occupied simpler and less desirable quarters, the architecture reflecting and reinforcing the social structure that governed life within these walls, every detail of spatial arrangement communicating something about power and position, about who was important and who was not, about who had access to whom and under what circumstances. The physical layout being inseparable from the social organisation, the buildings themselves encoding the hierarchies and the protocols that governed daily life. Understanding the harem requires first understanding the various categories of women who lived there and the hierarchical relationships among them. The structure being complex and being quite different from the simplistic image of interchangeable women all occupying the same basic position, reality being that harem women occupied dramatically different positions with dramatically different powers and possibilities and experiences, the distance between the Sultan's mother at the top of the hierarchy and a newly arrived slave girl at the bottom being as great as the distance between any monarch and any commoner in European courts, the hierarchy being steep and being elaborately articulated with many intermediate levels between the extremes. At the apex of the harem hierarchy stood the Valide Sultan, the Sultan's mother, who wielded enormous power not just within the harem but often within the empire more broadly, the Valide Sultan being one of the most powerful figures in Ottoman government during periods when sultans were young or weak, or when the Valide Sultan was particularly capable and ambitious, these women effectively ruling the empire from behind the scenes, making decisions about policy and appointments and resources, corresponding with foreign powers and managing vast networks of clients and supporters, their power being real and substantial, and being exercised through both official channels, since the Valide Sultan had formal positions and responsibilities within the palace hierarchy, and through informal influence that came from their relationships with the Sultan and with other powerful figures within the government, the most capable Valide Sultans being among the most effective rulers that the Ottoman Empire ever had, though their achievements were often obscured or minimised by historians who were uncomfortable with the idea of women wielding such power, or who were operating within historiographical traditions that focused on sultans and grand viziers and military campaigns rather than on the domestic politics and the informal power networks that were actually crucial to how the empire functioned. Below the Valide Sultan in the hierarchy were the Sultan's consorts, with his legal wives, when he had them, occupying the highest rank among the consorts, though Ottoman practice varied over time regarding legal marriage, early sultans often having multiple wives as was permitted under Islamic law, while later sultans, particularly from the 16th century onward, typically did not formally marry, but rather took their consorts from among enslaved women who had been given to them, or who had been purchased for the palace, the preference for enslaved concubines over free wives reflecting complex political considerations, marriages with free women creating powerful in-law families who might have their own agendas and their own power bases, while taking consorts from among enslaved women who had no families or connections outside the palace meant that the consorts were entirely dependent on the Sultan and had no competing loyalties, the practice being strategic rather than being merely about preference or pleasure. Sultans choosing to build their intimate lives in ways that served political purposes, avoiding entanglements that might complicate their rule or create obligations they preferred not to have. Among the consorts who were not legally married to the Sultan, distinctions were made based on whether they had borne him children, particularly sons, mothers of princes occupying higher positions than women who had not produced children or who had produced only daughters, the hierarchy among consorts being fluid and being determined partly by the Sultan's current favour and partly by more objective factors, like having produced sons who might inherit the throne, women's positions within the harem hierarchy being subject to change based on changing circumstances, today's favourite potentially being tomorrow's forgotten figure, while the mother of a prince who became Sultan Valide could rise from a relatively modest position to become the most powerful woman in the empire, the possibilities for mobility within the hierarchy, creating dynamics of competition and alliance that were central to harem politics. Below the consorts were various categories of women in training, girls and young women who had been brought to the palace as slaves, purchased from markets or given as gifts by provincial governors or seized in wars, these enslaved women being trained in various skills and being evaluated for their potential to rise within the hierarchy, the most beautiful and talented potentially being selected to become consorts of the Sultan, while others might be married to palace officials or might remain in palace service in various capacities, the training being extensive and being designed to produce women who were cultured and skilled, who could sing and dance and play instruments, who could read and write, who understood palace protocol and etiquette, who could converse intelligently, and who embodied the refined elegance that Ottoman palace culture valued, the training taking years and being supervised by older women who taught the younger ones everything they needed to know about palace life and about how to navigate its complex social landscape, the education being comprehensive if somewhat specialised, preparing women specifically for life within palace culture, rather than providing general education that might be useful in other contexts, though of course the skills learned, literacy and artistic accomplishments and social graces, were valuable in various contexts, and many harem women who left the palace through marriage to officials or through other means found that their palace training served them well in their subsequent lives. At the bottom of the harem hierarchy were the numerous enslaved servants, who performed the actual labour necessary to maintain the large household, women who cleaned and cooked and did laundry, and who performed countless other tasks that kept the harem functioning, their work being essential but being largely invisible to those higher in the hierarchy who benefited from their labour, without necessarily noticing or acknowledging it, these enslaved workers being the foundation on which the entire elaborate structure rested, their daily toil making possible the refined leisure and the cultural activities and the political scheming that occupied the higher-ranking women. Without these workers, the harem could not have functioned, but their experiences and their perspectives were rarely recorded and rarely considered important by contemporaries who were interested in the dramatic stories of powerful women and royal favourites, rather than in the mundane realities of domestic labour, the erasure of these women from historical accounts being typical of how enslaved people's experiences have been treated across many societies and many periods, their essential contributions being taken for granted while their individual lives and experiences were seen as unworthy of record or attention. The physical layout of the harem reflected and reinforced these hierarchical distinctions, with the Valide Sultan occupying the largest and most elaborately decorated apartments, her rooms being palatial and being furnished with the finest textiles and furnishings and decorative objects, her space being designed to communicate her status and to provide appropriate setting for her activities, which included not just private life, but also semi-public functions, receiving important visitors and conducting business and managing her vast household, her apartments being both private residence and political office, combining functions that modern people would tend to separate but that were integrated in Ottoman palace culture, where the personal and the political were thoroughly intertwined. The Sultan's favourite consorts occupied quarters that were comfortable and well appointed, though not as grand as the Valide Sultan's, their rooms providing privacy and comfort while also being appropriately elegant for women of their status, the quarters being arranged so that the Sultan could visit discreetly, with corridors and passages allowing him to move between different parts of the harem without being observed by those whose observation was not desired, the architecture facilitating both connection and separation, allowing intimacy while also maintaining the structures and protocols that governed palace life. The women in training and the lower-ranking concubines occupied dormitory-style spaces where multiple women shared large rooms, their accommodations being much simpler and more crowded, privacy being minimal and luxury being largely absent, though even these spaces were clean and adequate if not comfortable or elegant. The differences in accommodation, communicating clearly the differences in status, providing daily reminders of hierarchy and of one's position within it, the physical environment being inseparable from the social environment, each reinforcing the other, making status visible and tangible in ways that shaped how women understood themselves and others, how they navigated their world and how they imagined their possibilities. The daily routine within the harem was structured and regulated, with set times for various activities and with expectations about behaviour that were clearly defined and that were enforced through the hierarchy, older women supervising younger ones and the Valide Sultan or her deputies overseeing the entire establishment, maintaining order and ensuring that protocols were followed and that standards were maintained. The day began early with morning prayers, Islam being the religion of the empire, and Islamic practice being integrated into daily life, though the degree of religious observance varied among individuals, some women being deeply pious while others were more casual in their practice. But certain basic observances like the 5 daily prayers were expected, and were part of the routine that structured time, the call to prayer providing audible markers that divided the day into segments, and that reminded everyone of the larger religious framework within which Ottoman life was supposed to be conducted, the integration of religious practice into daily routine being so complete that it was simply part of what it meant to live in Ottoman culture, not something separate or optional, but something woven into the fabric of ordinary life. After morning prayers came breakfast, which was taken communally in some parts of the harem, and individually in others depending on status, the Valide Sultan and the highest-ranking consorts taking their meals in their own apartments served by their personal attendants, while lower-ranking women ate together in common dining areas, the meals being substantial if not elaborate for most residents. Ottoman cuisine being rich and diverse and palace kitchens producing high-quality food, though the most elaborate dishes were reserved for the Sultan and for the highest-ranking women, while others ate simpler fare, bread and cheese and olives and various cooked dishes, yogurt and fruit and sweets, tea being consumed throughout the day and being central to Ottoman social life, the preparation and serving of tea being ritualized, and being occasions for conversation and social bonding, women gathering over tea to talk and to share news, and to maintain the relationships that were so important in the closed world of the harem, where everyone depended on complex networks of alliance and patronage to navigate their lives and to pursue their interests. The morning hours after breakfast were typically devoted to various productive activities, the specific activities depending on one's position in the hierarchy and one's particular skills and interests. Women in training spending time on lessons, learning music or embroidery or poetry, or other accomplishments that were valued in palace culture, their education being intensive and being supervised by skilled teachers who were themselves older, harem residents who had mastered these arts and who passed them on to new generations. The transmission of culture and skill being one of the harem's important functions, preserving and reproducing the refined palace culture that distinguished the Ottoman court from provincial cultures, maintaining standards of elegance and accomplishment that were markers of civilization and sophistication. Higher-ranking women might spend morning hours on various projects, embroidering elaborate textiles or composing poetry, or reading or corresponding with contacts outside the palace. Literate women writing letters that maintained relationships and that sometimes dealt with serious political or financial matters. The Valide Sultan and other powerful women managing extensive patronage networks and various business interests, controlling properties and foundations and commercial ventures that generated income and that extended their influence beyond palace walls. Their activities being simultaneously personal and political, maintaining their positions requiring constant work, relationships needing to be cultivated and potential rivals needing to be monitored, and alliances needing to be maintained. The informal politics of the harem being as demanding as any formal political role, and requiring similar skills in assessment of people and situations, and in strategic thinking about how to advance one's interests, while managing the interests and the ambitions of others who might be allies or might be competitors depending on circumstances. The enslaved servants spent their mornings on the endless work of maintaining the large household, cleaning rooms and corridors, washing linens and clothes, preparing food in the kitchens, drawing water and carrying supplies and performing countless other tasks, their labour being hard and being unrelenting, the work never being finished because new tasks constantly appeared, rooms needing to be cleaned again and again, clothes needing to be washed regularly, food needing to be prepared multiple times each day, the routine being exhausting and being largely unrewarded beyond basic maintenance of life. These women having little hope of rising in the hierarchy and having few of the opportunities that were theoretically available to the women in training who might attract attention and might rise to become favourites or might be married advantageously. The enslaved workers being trapped in positions that offered little beyond survival, their days being consumed by labour that benefited others while bringing them minimal reward or recognition. Midday brought another meal and another prayer time, the rhythm of the day being punctuated by these regular intervals. 5 prayers spread across the day from dawn to night, each prayer time being announced by call from minarets of nearby mosques, the sound penetrating the harem walls and providing temporal structure that was religious in origin, but that functioned as much as practical timekeeping device, organising the day into segments that everyone recognised and that helped coordinate activities across the large household, where not everyone could see everyone else, and where communication depended partly on these shared temporal markers. After midday prayers and meal, the afternoon hours were often devoted to more leisurely activities, at least for those whose status allowed for leisure, higher-ranking women gathering in common rooms or in gardens, weather permitting, to socialise and to entertain themselves, conversation and music and storytelling filling the hours, women playing instruments and singing, others embroidering while listening or simply relaxing, the social life of the harem being important for maintaining morale and for creating the bonds that made life in this closed community bearable. Women forming friendships and alliances, sometimes genuine and deep and sometimes strategic and calculated, the line between friendship and political alliance being blurry in environment, where personal relationships had political implications, and where one's position depended partly on who one's friends were and who one's patrons were. Navigating these relationships requiring emotional intelligence and social skill, understanding what others wanted and needed, and how to provide it, or to appear to provide it, how to be useful and pleasing while also pursuing one's own interests, the balance being delicate and the consequences of miscalculation being potentially serious. The afternoon was also when the Sultan might visit the harem if he chose to, his visits being occasions that created ripples of preparation and excitement and anxiety depending on who he was visiting and who he was ignoring, his attention being a valuable resource that women competed for and that brought tangible benefits. Favour potentially meaning gifts and privileges and enhanced status, potentially meaning bearing children who might become heirs, potentially meaning influence that could be used to help relatives or allies, or to pursue personal projects, while being ignored or being out of favour could mean declining status and reduced resources and vulnerability to rivals who might take advantage of weakness. The Sultan's favour being fickle and being influenced by many factors, physical attraction certainly, but also personality and wit, and political considerations. Sultans choosing favourites for complex mixtures of reasons that women tried to understand and to manipulate, but that remained somewhat unpredictable, creating permanent uncertainty about one's position, and permanent need to work to maintain or improve status, complacency being dangerous because circumstances could change rapidly, today's favourite becoming tomorrow's forgotten figure if the Sultan's attention shifted elsewhere, or if political circumstances changed in ways that affected his preferences or his calculations about whom to favour. Evening brought another meal and another prayer time, the day winding down toward night, the hours after dinner being quieter, women retiring to their quarters or gathering in small groups for conversation, the public social life of the afternoon giving way to more private and intimate interactions, friendships being maintained in quiet conversations, plans being discussed, anxieties being shared or concealed depending on whom one trusted and whom one feared, the complexity of relationships making even private conversations potentially fraught, one never being entirely certain that words shared in confidence would remain confidential, that apparent friends might not be reporting conversations to rivals or to superiors, the atmosphere being one where trust was valuable but was also dangerous, where forming close bonds was necessary for psychological survival, but was also risky because betrayal was always possible, making emotional life complicated and making genuine intimacy difficult. Women learning to manage their expressions and their words, to reveal only what was safe to reveal, to maintain pleasant surfaces while keeping deeper thoughts and feelings protected. The emotional management being exhausting but being necessary for survival, in an environment where everyone was watching everyone else, and where any sign of weakness or any unguarded statement might be used against one by rivals or by superiors who were always alert for threats or for opportunities to exploit. The vigilance being constant and being wearying, contributing to stress and to emotional fatigue that were part of life for many harem residents, even though their material circumstances might be comfortable, and even though their lives might appear to outsiders to be privileged, or even enviable. The night brought final prayers and sleep, though for some women the night might also bring visits from the Sultan, his nighttime visits being both desired and feared. Desired because they brought opportunity for favour and advancement, but feared because they brought pressure to please, and because failure to please could bring decline, women's positions being vulnerable to the Sultan's changing preferences and changing needs, his satisfaction being crucial but being difficult to predict or to ensure, requiring not just physical attractiveness, though that mattered, but also personality and intelligence and skill in reading situations and responding appropriately, understanding what the Sultan wanted not just physically but emotionally and even politically, since sultans were political beings whose intimate lives were entangled with their political lives in ways that made being a successful consort require political skill as much as personal charm. The successful consorts being those who understood this and who could navigate the complex terrain where personal and political intersected, where pleasing the Sultan meant understanding him as whole person with multiple needs and concerns rather than seeing the relationship in purely personal or purely physical terms. The sophistication required being considerable and being part of what palace training was supposed to provide, teaching women not just arts and graces but also the deeper skills of reading people and situations and responding effectively, education in emotional intelligence and strategic thinking being as important as education in music or embroidery, though less explicitly acknowledged in formal curricula. For the enslaved servants, the night brought exhaustion and minimal rest, their quarters being crowded and uncomfortable, their work resuming early the next morning, their lives being cycles of labour with minimal variation or relief, day following day in grinding repetition, their youth and energy being consumed in service to others, their own desires and possibilities being mostly irrelevant to the system that employed them and that benefited from their labour. These women being the invisible foundation on which the entire elaborate structure of the harem rested, their essential contributions being taken for granted, their suffering being unremarked and being considered unimportant by those who benefited from their work, the hierarchy being steep and being reinforced by every aspect of daily life, those at the bottom serving those above them while receiving minimal consideration or reward, the structure being accepted as natural by most of those who lived within it, including many of those who occupied subordinate positions. The ideological justification being that hierarchy was divinely ordained, and that one's position reflected one's nature or one's merit or divine will, rationalizations that made the system seem legitimate rather than arbitrary or oppressive, making resistance seem not just difficult but actually wrong, impious, contrary to proper order, the ideological dimension being crucial to maintaining the system, making those who suffered within it less likely to resist or even to question, accepting their positions as natural and inevitable, rather than seeing them as products of human choices and human power relationships that could potentially be different. The education and training that characterized harem life for women in training was extensive and was designed to produce refined and cultured women who embodied Ottoman ideals of feminine accomplishment and elegance, the training being both practical, teaching skills that would be useful in palace life, and cultural, instilling values and aesthetic sensibilities that marked palace women as distinct from women outside the palace, the education creating identity and creating belonging. Women who had been through palace training being part of a distinct group who shared common culture and common standards, recognizing each other through their speech and their manners and their tastes, the shared training creating bonds even as the hierarchy created divisions, women who had been trained together having connections that lasted even when their subsequent careers took them in different directions, some becoming powerful consorts or being married to important officials, while others remained in palace service in various capacities, the network of palace-trained women extending throughout the empire and creating informal channels of information and influence that connected the palace to provincial centres. Former harem women who had been married to governors or administrators, maintaining connections to the palace and potentially serving as sources of information or as agents of influence, their palace training making them valuable as wives precisely because they understood palace culture and palace protocols, and could represent their husbands appropriately in contexts where such understanding mattered. The education in music was particularly emphasised, Ottoman palace culture valuing musical accomplishment highly, and maintaining orchestras and ensembles of highly trained musicians, many of them harem women who had been taught by master musicians and who performed at palace events, and who taught the next generation of students, the transmission of musical culture being one of the harem's important functions, preserving classical Ottoman musical traditions and training performers who maintained the high standards that palace culture demanded, women learning to play various instruments, particularly those considered appropriate for female performers like the oud and the kanan and various percussion instruments, learning to sing in the elaborate vocal styles that Ottoman classical music employed, learning to perform both solo and in ensembles, acquiring the technical skill and the interpretive sensitivity that distinguished accomplished performers from mere amateurs, the training being rigorous and being supervised by demanding teachers who maintained high standards and who pushed students to develop their abilities fully, musical education being not just about learning to play instruments, but about understanding music theory, and about developing aesthetic judgment, and about embodying the refined sensibility that Ottoman culture valued, music being understood as one of the highest forms of cultural expression, and as marker of civilization and sophistication, societies that valued and produced sophisticated music being considered more advanced and more refined than societies that did not, the cultivation of musical culture being thus not just personal accomplishment, but also collective project of maintaining civilization itself, making musical training in the harem about more than individual education, being about preserving and transmitting crucial aspects of Ottoman cultural heritage. Training in textile arts was also extensive, women learning embroidery and weaving and various other techniques for creating the elaborate textiles that were central to Ottoman material culture, palace textiles being extraordinarily sophisticated and being valued throughout the Mediterranean world and beyond, Ottoman silks and velvets and brocades being luxury goods that commanded high prices, and that were given as diplomatic gifts, and that embodied Ottoman aesthetic ideals in their patterns and colours, and technical sophistication, harem women's work contributing to this textile production, creating pieces for palace use, and sometimes creating pieces for sale or for gift. Their labour being skilled and being valuable even when it was not necessarily recognised or compensated appropriately, the textiles they produced being admired and valued while their own contributions being often anonymous and uncelebrated, their work being attributed to the palace generally rather than to individual creators, the erasure of individual artistry being typical of how women's work was treated in many contexts where production was valued but producers were not, where objects were admired but makers were forgotten, the pattern being so common as to be unremarkable to contemporaries, even though it represented genuine injustice, women's skilled labour enriching others while bringing them minimal recognition or reward, their contributions being essential but being taken for granted, their creativity and skill being exploited without acknowledgement. Literacy education was provided to many harem women, though the extent and depth varied depending on various factors, including the girl's apparent and the preferences of those supervising her training, and the resources available for education at particular times, reading and writing being valuable skills that enhance women's usefulness, and that opened possibilities for more sophisticated roles within palace culture, literate women being able to read poetry and religious texts, being able to write letters that maintained relationships and that sometimes dealt with substantive matters of business or politics, being able to engage with the textual dimensions of Ottoman culture in ways that illiterate women could not, literacy being marker of education and refinement that enhanced status and that created opportunities, though of course literacy alone did not guarantee advancement, many literate women remaining in relatively modest positions, while some illiterate women rose through other means, beauty and personality and luck. Being as important as education in determining fates, the multiplicity of factors making outcomes somewhat unpredictable, creating both hope since anyone might rise regardless of background or limitations, and anxiety since even those who did everything right might not succeed, success depending on factors beyond one's control, including the Sultan's preferences and the political circumstances and the actions of rivals, and simply the luck of being in the right place at the right time, making careers in the harem somewhat like careers in any highly competitive environment, where outcomes depend on complex combinations of merit and circumstances and chance. The political dimensions of harem life were significant, and are often underappreciated in accounts that focus on the personal and the domestic, the harem being not just household, but also political institution, where power was exercised and where the empire's future was shaped, through the raising of princes and through the influence that powerful women exercised over sultans, and over policy, the Valide Sultan and other powerful harem women being political actors, whose decisions affected millions of people, and whose influence extended across the empire and sometimes beyond its borders, their political activity being conducted through different channels than the politics practiced by male officials, but being no less real and no less consequential, for being conducted through informal networks, and through influence over sultans rather than through formal positions in governmental hierarchy, the gendered nature of Ottoman politics meaning that women's political activity looked different from men's, but was not necessarily less important or less effective. Women wielding power through relationships and through control of resources and through patronage networks, rather than through formal offices, but the power being genuine and being substantial for those who managed to accumulate it, the most successful female political actors being as capable and as effective as their male counterparts, navigating complex political landscapes and building alliances and neutralizing rivals and pursuing agendas that reflected their own interests and values and visions for the empire, their political creativity being impressive, and their achievements being considerable, despite the constraints they faced. Constraints that included not just the formal exclusion from most official positions, but also the ideological assumption that women should not be political actors, assumption that they had to work against or around, finding ways to exercise power while nominally not exercising power, influencing decisions while appearing merely to be supporting male decision-makers, the performance of powerlessness while actually being powerful, being skill that successful political women mastered, understanding that appearing too powerful too openly would trigger resistance and backlash, that effective female power required disguise and indirection, required working through others while maintaining deniability, required patience and subtlety and willingness to let others take credit while retaining actual control. The sophistication of these political strategies being remarkable, and being testimony to the intelligence and the capability of women who operated under severe constraints but who nonetheless managed to shape events and to influence outcomes in ways that mattered enormously. The raising of princes was one of the harem's most important functions, future sultans spending their early years within the harem under the care and tutelage of their mothers, and other harem women, their early education being supervised by women even though male tutors were brought in for formal instruction in various subjects. The influence of mothers and other female relatives on young princes being considerable and being lasting, shaping their characters and their values and their understandings of politics and power. Sultans' later policies and preferences often reflecting the influences of their early years and the lessons taught by mothers who understood that raising future sultans was perhaps their most important contribution to the empire. Women who had themselves risen from slavery to become mothers of heirs, having unique perspectives on power and on social mobility, and on the arbitrary nature of status, their life experiences giving them understandings of the empire and of human nature that were different from those of men who had been born into privilege and who had never experienced the vulnerability and the powerlessness that these women had experienced in their younger years. The combination of having been powerless and having become powerful, giving them complex perspectives that shaped how they raised their sons and what they taught them about ruling and about the responsibilities of power. Some mothers teaching their sons to be just and merciful rulers who remembered that even the most exalted had once been humble and that fortune was changeable, while other mothers taught their sons to be ruthless and suspicious, to trust no one and to eliminate threats before threats could materialize. The variety of approaches reflecting the different lessons that different women had drawn from their own experiences, some being embittered and hardened by what they had endured, while others were made compassionate and thoughtful. The diversity of responses being testimony to the complexity of human nature and to the way that similar experiences can produce very different effects depending on individual temperament and individual interpretation of what one has experienced. The succession politics within the harem were often intense, and sometimes were literally matters of life and death, princes competing for succession and their mothers competing on their behalf, forming alliances and working to undermine rivals, mothers of different princes being natural rivals since only one prince would inherit the throne, and the mother of the sultan who inherited would become Valide Sultan, with enormous power, while the mothers of unsuccessful princes might face marginalization or even danger if the new sultan saw them as threats. The stakes being high and the competition being fierce, women employing various strategies to advance their sons' prospects, building alliances with powerful officials, cultivating support among janissaries and among religious authorities, managing public perception, and trying to ensure that their sons were seen as most qualified and most suitable candidates. The competition creating atmosphere of intrigue and suspicion, where everyone was watching everyone else, and where today's ally might be tomorrow's rival, depending on how circumstances evolved. The uncertainty and the high stakes creating stress and paranoia, mothers becoming hyper-vigilant about threats to their sons, real and imagined, sometimes taking drastic action to protect their interests. The succession politics within the harem being as complex and as ruthless as any political competition anywhere. The additional factor being that these competitions were among women who lived together in the same household, who saw each other daily and who could not escape each other's presence, making the rivalries more intense and more personal than rivalries among political actors who operated in different spheres and who could maintain distance from each other, the proximity forcing constant navigation of complex relationships where everyone had to maintain surface civility while pursuing conflicting interests, the emotional and psychological demands being considerable, requiring constant performance and constant management of presentation, never being able to relax or to lower guard because any moment of carelessness might be exploited by rivals who were always watching for opportunities. The experience of enslaved women in the harem was dramatically different from the experience of free women and of higher-ranking consorts, their lives being defined by labour and subordination rather than by opportunity and possibility, their daily existence being one of service and of obedience, with minimal control over their circumstances and minimal prospects for improvement, sold or given into slavery, and brought to the palace through various routes, some being purchased in slave markets, others being given as gifts or as tribute by provincial governors or by foreign ambassadors. still others being seized in wars or raids and distributed as human property, their enslavement being rationalised through various ideological frameworks, including religious justifications that permitted enslavement of non-Muslims captured in war, and racial hierarchies that categorised some peoples as naturally suited for servitude. These rationalisations being accepted by most contemporaries as legitimate and natural. Few people questioning the fundamental institution of slavery, or seeing it as problematic rather than as normal and necessary part of social order. The acceptance of slavery being nearly universal in Ottoman society, and indeed in most societies of the period. Alternatives to slave labour not being readily apparent to most people who assumed that certain kinds of work required forced labour, and that slavery was therefore inevitable. Abolition movements and anti-slavery ideology being later developments that would eventually delegitimise slavery, but that did not exist in forms that influenced Ottoman policy during the period when the empire was at its height, slavery being simply how things were done and being largely unquestioned, except by a few voices that contemporaries dismissed as impractical, or as not understanding economic and social necessities. The daily lives of enslaved harem servants were structured around work, their time being consumed by the endless tasks of maintaining the large household, cleaning being never-ending because spaces that were clean in the morning needed cleaning again by evening, dirt and dust accumulating constantly, requiring daily attention, rooms being swept and mopped, corridors being washed, textiles being brushed and aired, the work being physically demanding and being performed with simple tools that made it labour-intensive, no mechanical aids existing to ease the burden, everything being done by hand and by physical effort, backs bent over mops and brooms, arms growing tired from scrubbing and carrying, feet aching from standing and walking, bodies wearing out from years of such labour, aging prematurely, health declining, the work taking its toll in ways that were visible in the bent backs and the worn faces of long-time servants, women who might be chronologically relatively young but who looked old, their youth having been consumed in service, their bodies broken by endless labour, their spirits often broken as well by the monotony and the thanklessness of their work, performing essential tasks that benefited others while receiving minimal appreciation or reward, their labour being taken for granted, expected, their existence being valued only insofar as they could work, their humanity being largely ignored or denied by those they served, some of whom saw enslaved servants as more like tools or animals than like people, the dehumanization being necessary to maintain the system, since recognizing full humanity of enslaved people would make it difficult to treat them as property and to exploit their labour without compunction. The psychological distance between enslaved and free being maintained through various mechanisms, including the ideology that justified slavery, and including the daily practices of command and obedience that reinforced power relationships and that made subordination seem natural. The system reproducing itself partly through the internalization of hierarchical assumptions by those within it, including sometimes by the enslaved themselves who might accept their own subordination as natural or inevitable. Having limited exposure to alternatives and having limited ability to imagine different possibilities, their resistance to their conditions being sometimes absent, not because they were content, but because resistance seemed pointless or impossible, because hope had been crushed by circumstances that offered no prospect of change, leaving them to endure as best they could while maintaining whatever small measures of dignity and of meaning they could create within the constraints of their situations. The diet of harem residents varied according to status, the Valide Sultan and the highest-ranking consorts eating elaborate meals prepared by skilled cooks and served on fine porcelain or precious metal dishes, their meals being events that combine nutrition with ceremony and with aesthetic pleasure, food being presented beautifully and being consumed in settings that emphasised the diner's status. While lower-ranking women ate simpler fare served in more basic vessels, their meals being adequate nutritionally but being plain, and being served without ceremony, the food being fuel more than pleasure, sustenance more than experience, the differences in how people ate reflecting and reinforcing the differences in their status, even something as basic as food being caught up in the elaborate hierarchies that structured palace life. Those at the top eating food that was not just more abundant but also more refined, more elaborately prepared, more carefully presented, their meals being expressions of their position, as much as being nutrition, while those at the bottom ate whatever was provided with minimal choice or variety, their meals being utilitarian, designed to keep them alive and able to work rather than to provide pleasure or satisfaction. The contrast being stark and being experienced daily, every meal being a reminder of hierarchy, every bite communicating status. The food system within the palace being microcosm of the larger social system, displaying in edible form the inequalities and the hierarchies that structured the entire institution, making status tangible and making it literally embodied in the different ways that different people were nourished, or not nourished, sustained or merely kept alive, satisfied or left hungry despite being fed. The question of consent and of agency in the lives of harem women is complex and requires careful consideration, avoiding both the tendency to see them as purely victims without any power or choice, and the opposite tendency to romanticize their situations as more positive than they actually were, reality being that different women had different degrees of agency and different possibilities, depending on their positions and their circumstances and their individual capabilities. Some women exercising considerable power and making meaningful choices, while others were genuinely powerless and had their lives entirely controlled by others. The spectrum being wide and the experiences being diverse, generalizations being difficult because the harem was not a monolithic institution, where everyone had same experience, but was rather complex social world, where different positions brought different possibilities. A woman who rose to become Valide Sultan had vastly different experience from a newly arrived slave girl, though both nominally lived in same institution, their lives being so different as to be almost incomparable, making statements about harem women in general being problematic without specifying which harem women in which positions and which circumstances. For those at the top of the hierarchy, women who had successfully navigated the system, and who had risen to positions of power, agency was substantial, and choices were real. These women making decisions that affected not just their own lives, but the lives of many others, their power being circumscribed by various constraints, but being genuine within those constraints. They were not free in any absolute sense, but they had meaningful ability to shape their circumstances and to pursue their goals, their success testifying to their capability and their strategic intelligence. Women who had started as enslaved teenagers and who had become among the most powerful people in the empire, their trajectories being remarkable and being testimony to the possibilities that the system created, even as it created profound injustices and suffering for many others, the complexity being that the same system that enslaved and oppressed many also created opportunities for some, that it was simultaneously oppressive and enabling depending on whose experience one examined, making moral judgments about the institution complicated. Clearly it caused harm and clearly it violated modern principles about human rights and human dignity, but within its own logic it provided pathways for advancement that some women successfully navigated, their success being real even though it was built on a foundation of slavery and subordination that modern ethics properly condemns. For those in the middle of the hierarchy, the women in training and the lower-ranking concubines, agency was limited but not entirely absent. They had some choices within narrow parameters, some ability to influence their own trajectories even if they could not control them, their success depending partly on factors beyond their control like their beauty and the Sultan's preferences and the political circumstances and sheer luck, but depending also on their own efforts and skills and strategic choices, how well they learned palace arts, how effectively they navigated the social landscape, what alliances they formed and what enmities they avoided, their agency being real but being constrained. They were not puppets, but neither were they free. They operated within systems that limited their possibilities, but within those limits they made choices that mattered, that affected outcomes, that gave them some measure of control, even if only partial control over their lives and futures. Their experiences being testimony to the human capacity to create meaning and to exercise agency, even in constrained circumstances, to find room for choice even when choice is limited, to maintain dignity even when dignity is under assault. Their resistance or accommodation or strategic engagement with the system being acts of agency even when the options were all in some sense constrained by structures they did not create and could not escape. For those at the bottom, the enslaved servants, agency was minimal and possibilities were severely constrained, their lives being largely determined by others, their days being consumed by assigned tasks performed under supervision, their ability to shape their circumstances being limited mostly to small resistances and small adaptations, doing tasks slowly when not observed, taking brief unauthorized rests, maintaining human connections with other enslaved workers that provided emotional sustenance, and that created spaces where they could be something other than merely workers, preserving songs or stories or traditions from their pre-enslavement lives when possible, maintaining interior lives that the system could not completely control, even when it controlled their time and their labour and their bodies, their humanity persisting despite systematic attempts to reduce them to mere instruments of labour, their agency being limited but not being entirely absent. Even in most constrained circumstances, people find ways to assert themselves and to maintain some measure of autonomy, however small, the human need for agency being so fundamental that it persists even when circumstances make exercising agency extremely difficult and extremely costly. Enslaved people throughout history and across cultures, finding ways to resist and to survive and to maintain their humanity, despite the dehumanizing systems that sought to reduce them to property, their resistance being testimony to the resilience of human spirit and to the impossibility of completely extinguishing human agency no matter how oppressive the system. Though of course this resilience came at enormous cost and involved suffering that should not be romanticized or minimized, celebrating peoples to maintain humanity in inhumane circumstances should not distract from condemning the inhumane circumstances themselves. The harem's relationship to the outside world was mediated and controlled, women within the harem being largely separated from the world beyond palace walls, but not being entirely isolated, connections being maintained through various channels including letters and visitors, and through enslaved servants who moved between harem and outside world in course of performing errands and tasks. Eunuchs who served as intermediaries between the secluded harem and the male spaces of palace and city. Merchants who supplied the harem with goods, and who sometimes brought news along with their merchandise. The porosity of the boundaries being greater than the ideal of complete seclusion would suggest, information flowing in and out through various informal channels, despite formal restrictions, harem women knowing more about the outside world than theory of seclusion would predict, an outside world knowing more about the harem than it was supposed to, though what outsiders thought they knew was often distorted by rumour and by Orientalist fantasy. The actual realities of harem life being obscured by layers of speculation and exaggeration, and deliberate mystification. The mystery surrounding the harem serving various purposes including protecting palace privacy and enhancing palace mystique. The less outsiders knew, the more they imagined, and what they imagined often served to make the palace and the Sultan seem more exotic and more powerful and more mysterious. The mystique being useful politically, even as it created misunderstandings that persist to the present, making it difficult for modern people to understand what the harem actually was because centuries of accumulated fantasy and misinformation obscure the historical realities. The architectural beauty of the harem spaces is worth noting, though descriptions must be based on the historical structures that survive rather than on Orientalist fantasy. The actual spaces being elegant and sophisticated but being primarily functional, designed for living, and for the various activities that filled harem days, rather than being designed primarily for visual spectacle, or for the erotic scenarios that Western fantasy imagined. Rooms being decorated with tiles and carved wood and painted ceilings, with fountains providing both aesthetic pleasure and practical cooling in hot climate, with gardens offering outdoor spaces where women could experience nature and fresh air within the protected boundaries of the palace complex, the gardens being carefully designed and carefully maintained, providing beauty and tranquility that offered some relief from the intense social pressures and the political intrigues that characterized harem life. Time spent in gardens being valued by many harem residents as opportunity for relative privacy and for connection with natural world that was otherwise largely inaccessible to them, confined as they were within palace walls, the gardens being spaces of relative freedom within the larger space of confinement, places where the hierarchies and the protocols could be briefly relaxed, where women could walk and sit and think without being constantly observed and judged, where they could experience moments of peace that were rare in their otherwise highly structured and highly surveilled lives, the gardens being thus not mere decoration but being essential features that made palace life bearable, providing psychological relief and providing spaces where human needs for beauty and tranquility and connection with nature could be at least partially satisfied despite the constraints of palace life. The medical care available within the harem varied according to status, as did everything else in the highly stratified environment. The Valide Sultan and highest-ranking consorts having access to the best medical practitioners available in the empire, physicians being summoned to attend them when they were ill, their health being considered important enough to warrant significant expenditure and attention, while lower-ranking women had access to less skilled practitioners or to folk remedies administered by other harem residents who had accumulated practical knowledge about treating common ailments, the hierarchy being visible even in illness, even in vulnerability, those at the top being cared for by experts while those at the bottom had to rely on whatever limited resources were available, childbirth being particularly dangerous for all women regardless of status, maternal mortality being high throughout the population, the dangers of childbirth being such that pregnancy was often fearful time, rather than purely celebratory time. Women knowing that bringing children into the world might cost them their own lives. Some women dying in childbirth despite the best available care. The medical knowledge of the period being insufficient to prevent many complications, making childbearing a time of genuine danger that women faced with whatever combination of hope and fear their circumstances and temperaments produced. Those who survived births often facing additional dangers during recovery, when infections could develop, and when various postpartum complications could emerge, the period immediately after birth being particularly dangerous, requiring care and rest that might or might not be available, depending on the woman's status and on the resources allocated to her care. The religious life within the harem was complex, Islam being the official religion of the empire, and Islamic practice being integrated into daily life, through prayers, and through observance of religious festivals and through various other practices, but the depth and nature of religious observance varying among individuals and being influenced by various factors including personal piety and the backgrounds that women brought with them to the palace, some harem residents having been born Muslim while others had converted from Christianity or other religions either willingly or under compulsion, the religious diversity of harem backgrounds being greater than official ideology acknowledged. The fiction being that all harem residents were Muslim, but the reality being more complicated, some women maintaining private attachments to their birth religions, or maintaining syncretic practices that combined elements from different traditions, the privacy of the harem allowing for religious diversity that would not have been tolerated in more public settings, the authorities often preferring not to inquire too closely into the private religious practices of harem women, as long as public conformity to Islamic norms was maintained. The pragmatism reflecting understanding that forcing religious uniformity would be difficult and might be counterproductive. Better to allow some private diversity while maintaining public orthodoxy, the accommodation being typical of Ottoman approach to diversity more generally, the empire being relatively tolerant by standards of its time, though still imposing various restrictions and indignities on non-Muslims, the balance between tolerance and discrimination being different from modern conceptions, but being more accommodating than many contemporary European states, where religious uniformity was more rigidly enforced, and where diversity was less accepted, the comparative tolerance being one of the features that made the Ottoman Empire relatively successful, for as long as it was, its ability to incorporate diverse populations without demanding complete cultural or religious assimilation, allowing it to rule vast territories containing many different peoples, though of course, this tolerance had limits and was always qualified by the ultimate supremacy of Islam and of Muslims within the Ottoman system, the hierarchy being religious as well as social and political, Muslims occupying superior position even when the system allowed non-Muslims to prosper and to maintain their communities and their practices within certain boundaries. The question of how to understand and evaluate the harem from modern perspectives is challenging and requires balancing various considerations, acknowledging the real harms and the genuine oppression that characterized the institution, while also recognizing the human complexity and the individual agency of people who lived within it, avoiding the tendency to see historical actors purely as victims or purely as agents, recognizing that people in constrained circumstances still make choices and still have experiences that are rich and complex, and that deserve to be understood on their own terms rather than being reduced to simple narratives about oppression or about empowerment, the reality being more complicated than either narrative allows, the harem being site of both oppression and opportunity, both constraint and creativity, both suffering and flourishing, different individuals having different experiences depending on their positions and their capabilities and their luck, some women prospering and exercising power while others suffered and were exploited, making moral evaluation complex, the institution clearly violated modern principles about freedom and equality and human rights, particularly in its foundation on slavery, and in its fundamental subordination of women to men, these aspects being properly condemned from modern ethical perspectives. But the institution also created spaces where some women exercised real power, and where women's culture flourished, and where female networks of influence operated. These aspects being historically interesting and being worthy of attention, even though they do not excuse or justify the oppressive foundations. Understanding the harem requiring holding these contradictions together, seeing both the harm and the human complexity, condemning the injustices while respecting the people who lived within the system, and who made whatever lives they could within the constraints they faced, avoiding both the Orientalist fantasy that romanticizes the harem as exotic paradise, and the opposite tendency to see it only as prison, or site of oppression. Reality being that it was neither paradise nor simple prison, but was rather complex social institution, where real people lived complex lives that mix constraint and possibility, suffering and satisfaction, subordination and power, in combinations that varied across time and across individuals, making the harem fascinating historical subject precisely because of its complexity and its refusal to fit into simple moral categories. The legacy of the harem in modern imagination continues to be shaped more by Orientalist fantasy than by historical reality, the popular understanding remaining remarkably resistant to correction, despite the efforts of historians who have tried to present more accurate and more nuanced accounts. The power of the fantasy being such that it overwhelms the facts, people preferring the exotic and titillating images that Orientalist tradition created to the more complex and more mundane realities that historical research reveals, the persistence of fantasy being frustrating to historians, but being understandable, given how deeply the Orientalist images have been embedded in Western culture through centuries of artistic and literary production, the images being so familiar and so widely circulated that they seem more real than reality, meeting people's expectations and confirming their assumptions in ways that accurate historical accounts do not. The pleasure of fantasy competing with the obligation of accuracy, and pleasure often winning, making it difficult to change popular understanding even when the historical evidence is clear and when scholars are in agreement about the basic outlines of what the harem actually was. The gap between scholarly understanding and popular understanding remaining wide and perhaps being unbridgeable, given the cultural investments that so many people have in maintaining the fantasies that serve various purposes in contemporary culture, including providing exotic escape and providing venues for projecting anxieties and desires about gender and sexuality and power, the harem fantasy being more about contemporary needs and contemporary imagination than about historical reality, making it difficult to dislodge because it serves functions that historical accuracy cannot serve, fantasy being useful in ways that fact is not, the persistence of fantasy despite facts being testimony to the power of imagination and to the ways that present needs shape understanding of past. History being not just what happened, but also what people want to believe happened, what fits their narratives and serves their purposes, what confirms their assumptions rather than challenging them. The struggle to promote accurate historical understanding being struggle against powerful psychological and cultural forces that favour comfortable fantasy over uncomfortable complexity. The harem being case where fantasy has been particularly powerful and particularly resistant to correction, making it emblematic of broader challenges that historians face in trying to promote nuanced understanding of past in contexts where simplified and sensationalized versions have already captured public imagination, and where people have limited interest in replacing familiar fantasies with complex realities that require more effort to understand and that provide less immediate gratification. The choice between easy fantasy and difficult reality being one that many people resolve in favour of fantasy, making the historian's task difficult, but also making it important. The work of replacing fantasy with fact being essential, even when it is difficult and even when success is uncertain. The effort being worthwhile because understanding past accurately is valuable in itself, and because the fantasies that obscure understanding often do real harm, perpetuating stereotypes and distorting perceptions in ways that affect how contemporary people think about cultures and peoples and issues. The Orientalist fantasy of the harem being not just historically inaccurate but also being politically problematic, perpetuating Western stereotypes about Islam and about Middle Eastern cultures and about gender and sexuality. making the work of replacing fantasy with accurate history being not just academic exercise, but being part of a larger project of promoting cross-cultural understanding and combating the prejudices and stereotypes that continue to distort contemporary perspectives and to influence contemporary politics in ways that are often harmful. The historical scholarship on the harem being thus not just about understanding past accurately, but also being about challenging persistent stereotypes and promoting more sophisticated and more respectful understanding of Ottoman culture and of Islamic societies more generally, the academic work having contemporary relevance and contemporary stakes that make it important beyond its intrinsic scholarly value, making the effort to understand the harem accurately being worthwhile, both for historical reasons and for contemporary political and cultural reasons, the past and the present being connected in ways that make historical understanding relevant for contemporary concerns, good history serving multiple purposes simultaneously including satisfying scholarly curiosity and promoting accurate understanding of past and also challenging contemporary myths and stereotypes, contributing to better cross-cultural understanding, promoting respect for different cultures and different ways of organising society. The scholarly work on the harem being exemplary of how historical research can serve these multiple purposes, providing accurate, detailed understanding of specific institution while also contributing to broader understandings and broader goals. The specific and the general being connected, the detailed historical work supporting larger projects of cross-cultural understanding and mutual respect that remain urgent in contemporary world where stereotypes and prejudices continue to distort understanding and to fuel conflicts,